Welcome back to Asset Horizon. This week on April 15th, 2026, Asset Horizon Research Commons kicks off its summer school enrollment, featuring a series of 5 courses delivered by friends of the podcast, covering everything from Fanon to Anders, Marx to Baudrillard, anarchism to aesthetics, and the politics of play and the crisis of eugenics in our time. Our goal is to pay instructors well, while keeping the price point accessible for our listeners and supporters. Previous courses are available in the AHRC course archives, and subscriptions help support the admin work that keeps this whole operation running. For those in a financial bind, we have provided plenty of ways to get involved, multiple scholarships to individual courses, and limited free subscriptions to those who support us on Patreon. We're committed to offering some of the most robust, interactive, and enriched engagements with philosophy and theory out there now, in a way that genuinely supports the community at every level. As of today, a few subscription spots still remain, accessible through the link in our monthly Patreon report. So if you are curious and want to peek at what we've been building, you can do so completely risk-free. Now, today's episode, we are joined by Callum Cant and Matthew Lee to discuss their new book, The Future in Our Past, The General Strike, 1926-2026. Let's listen.
Welcome to Asset Horizon, the Theory Podcast. And today we're going to be doing a bit of classic historical materialism by talking about the General Strike of 1926 that marks its 100th anniversary this year. And today we'll be looking at a new book on the General Strike, The Future in Our Past. And I'm delighted today to be joined by the authors Callum Cant and Matthew Lee to talk about the process of the General Strike, what went wrong, how do we understand what sort of class dynamics go into such a massive action, and where can we find the spectres of this revolt in organised labour today. Callum, Matthew, thank you for joining me.
Thanks so much for having us.
So, first of all, what is a general strike? We know it's a particular kind of tactic of organised labour, and I want to talk about, because we're always highly theory-based on this show, where it comes from. And one of the first things I learned from your book, that it comes from an idea which, and I think we should probably call it this now as well, a grand national holiday. We just put down tools, make a festival of our own resistance here.
So it's a tactic that is essentially born out of Britain is the first capitalist country, right? The first country to undergo that process of the Industrial Revolution. And it emerges out of the experience of the most advanced elements of the working class movement as that transition is ongoing. So your listeners might be familiar with E.P. Thompson, The History of the English Working Class, or Making English Working Class. That kind of experience, that revolutionary movement that he's talking about there, the Luddites, the Black Lamp, the insurrectionaries organising armies on the moors, the drill at night, those kind of experiences are transformed through the Industrial Revolution. And part of what comes out of that is the idea of the General Strike. So we tell the story in particular through the history of the tactic's probably first great progenitor, a guy called William Benbow, who was a radical shoemaker from near Manchester. So he was involved in 1817 in a kind of insurrectionary plot. He's never sleeping in the same place twice, moving all over the country, trying to organise for basic political rights. And the tactical kind of common sense that he's working within is a kind of a Jacobean one, in which you have a revolution by getting weapons and marching on London. That's the basic schema for how you would win things like the vote, right? And Benbow's involved in that kind of organising, only it goes wrong. And he gets imprisoned in London for a number of years. The thing you'll be remarkably surprised by when you read British labour history is quite how easily people seem to get away with things that would be like 30 years in Belmarsh now. But he tries to organise a revolution, doesn't work, does a few years, and then comes out again. And when he comes out, he's looking around his context, so the industrialising north of England, and he sees people using strike tactics. And he sees them using strike tactics successfully, despite the fact that they're illegal, and winning themselves major concessions. And so the leap that Benbow makes, and that people around Benbow make, is they start to think, well, what if this strike tactic could replace the insurrection and could be a new way of revolution? So instead of just getting weapons and marching on London, what if we all refuse to work and we use the strike to kind of set up a grand national holiday, or this collective mass action? So what's particular about the grand national holiday is that it's not around economic causes. It's a political use of the strike weapon, and it's viewed as universal. So every working person takes part. And if you actually read the pamphlet itself, it's kind of fantastic, because the grand national holiday is about both having time off from work, using the space created by the strike to reorganize social relations, complete transformation of the way that everyday life operates. The process of revolution is in the withdrawing of work. And, you take collective ownership of the resources of the parish, you do all this kind of stuff at the same time. And this idea, he starts propagating it, traveling around the country. Bembo's a fascinating figure. I mean, he's at times a pornographer, a printer, a publisher, a shoemaker. He does all sorts of crazy stuff. But he travels around the country and convinces the Chartist movement, which is this first political working class movement, agitating for the People's Charter, a set of basic political rights. And he convinces the Chartist movement that when we hand in a petition, this massive petition, the first petition, we should say, if Parliament doesn't accept our massive petition and give us the rights we ask for, then we should consider using a general strike as a tactic in response. Now, this wins at the Chartist National Convention. People are convinced of this, particularly people from the working class, more industrialised parts of Britain. They're like, yes, this is a really good idea. We support it. We'll go with it. He's been publishing his pamphlet for a number of years now. The tactic is kind of widely understood, even if it's not been used yet. So there's meant to be the first general strike in British history in 1839. What happens, and this is going to be an important theme throughout the entire history of general strikes, is that the Chartist leadership kind of bail on the idea. They go, oh no, this looks too much like revolution. We're scared. We're going to put it off, and we can do this later. Then a few years later, rather than asking for the Chartist leadership to call the tactic, it actually gets picked up by the rank and file, and it happens from below. So 1842, you have this thing called the plug plots, the plug riots, whatever you want to call them. Largest industrial dispute in the 19th century, the first general strike in history. It happens in Britain. You have columns of 10,000 people marching from industrial town to industrial town across the north of England with weapons, shutting down production. They're called the plug plots or the plug riots because they're taking the plugs out of the boilers for steam engines and draining the water out. So you have this kind of experience with the insurrectionary general strike, the revolutionary general strike, as a way of producing political change. Unfortunately, that 1842 general strike is defeated, and there is this then long hiatus throughout which the British labour movement undergoes a dramatic move to the right in the post-Chartist period. There is this creation of a labour aristocracy. Britain's industrial monopoly position in the global market allows for the general strike to diffuse and disappear and be lost to history in a way. But then when we get into much later in the century and into the 20th century, it starts coming back, right? And that's really where the modern history of the general strike picks up, and we build towards 1926, which is properly considered the second general strike in British history.
I think one thing also to add on to that is something really important to think about in terms of William Bembo and the production of the idea of the Grand National Holiday is this isn't something that he just abstractly theorizes in his mind, right? It's not like he's the first person to have this idea. He's gone through this political experience, like Callum said, of more conspiratorial, insurrectionary modes of revolution and had met the limitations of that. And at the same time, there are all these mass strikes happening across the country of various different professions, miners, weavers, etc. And he looks towards these struggles, and it's looking towards these struggles that informs him of this idea. So it's not something that's created in isolation of the broader movement and broader struggles, but is itself a product of them. And I think that's really important when we're thinking about the production of ideas, the production of strategy, and the various changing of class compositions, which I'm sure we'll go into, is that from the very outset, this is a product of struggle.
And if people are familiar with Rosa Luxemburg's 1905 pamphlet on the mass strike, this is a really influential way of thinking about the general strike that comes much later. But Rosa Luxemburg really influences, particularly in Glasgow, there's lots of militants who read that pamphlet in the run-up to some of the major strikes that happened there in 1919 in particular. She emphasizes this point massively, but does so drawing on a completely different set of historical experiences drawn from Russia rather than kind of the British tradition. So what we can do and hopefully do in the start of the book is bring that kind of Rosa Luxemburg theorization of general strike, and we add actually an earlier British example, but one that proves many of the same points.
No, absolutely. That was fantastic. I just want to draw out one of the threads of what you're talking about, particularly in terms of class composition. The term working class is thrown around a lot, and it can be a very flattening term. But one of the things I think the book is really great at articulating throughout the history of general strikes and the development of it from struggle is that it isn't just determined simply by a wider class struggle of one class versus another, but also from the exact divisions within the class itself. And I want to ask, can we unpack these terms, for example, of the labour aristocracy versus the rank and file? How does the labour aristocracy kind of accrete in terms of the development of certain kind of labor struggle, the development of certain kinds of organs, let's say, of organization, and how does this divide end up cashing itself out in terms of not only between the rank and file and the labor aristocracy, particularly the certain political role that the rank and file can play in this, which is the idea of the vanguard.
This is really the lodestar of how we think about the historical narrative in the book, right? These two terms, the aristocracy and the vanguard, that orientate a lot of how we talk about the period in question. But to locate the origin of the labour aristocracy in Britain, we need to go back to that kind of 1842 moment. So there is this giant revolutionary attempt at overturning the social system. It fails. Chartism fails. And in that kind of post-Chartist period, this is when Britain rises to its global ascendancy. And this global industrial monopoly gives the ruling class in Britain loads of resources. And with these resources, they can choose to do a number of different things, right? And what they particularly choose to do is to integrate the very upper stratum of the working class into this new capitalist system. So whereas previously, for instance, real wages for the vast majority of professions had not increased significantly year on year, you start to get a situation where the most advanced trades, the engineers, the stone cutters, traditionally the trades that weren't particularly involved in Chartism, they get absorbed into the kind of the British state in its most expansive form. So you get the emergence of legalized trade unionism. And with the emergence of legalized trade unionism, you get the form of conciliation and bargaining, whereby rather than the industrial conflict just being a straight battle between antagonistic parties, instead you get conciliation boards. These emerge out of the hosiery industry in Nottingham, whereby workers and managers are kind of negotiating rather than necessarily seeing each other as head-on antagonists. So the trade unions are the most advanced, or the trade unions are the richest parts of the working class start to get integrated, and that upper layer of skilled worker becomes initially an aristocracy. You can also see this really clearly in the workplace. So some of these labour aristocrats are increasingly being given control over elements of the labour process where they are expected to exercise authority over the people that they might manage, basically. So you would have a labour aristocrat or a very highly skilled worker who might manage a team of 5 or 6 less skilled workers. And that relationship of authority, they're no longer just working purely for the boss. They're also getting some of the boss's authority devolved onto them as corporations. Well, I mean, they're not corporations at this point, but as organizations start to develop a kind of more complicated managerial hierarchy, there are more slots for like middle managers. You also get these other, key vectors. So gender in particular, right? The creation of the male breadwinner family model. The male breadwinner is a labor aristocrat, right? If you're earning enough that nobody else in your family needs to work, you're part of a very privileged stratum of the working class, and you're given authority in the home. That not only do you have authority in the workplace, you also have it in the home. And increasingly, culturally, you might have it because there might be migrant sections of the working class, particularly Irish people, who you are considered to be, different to and superior to. So you get a kind of cultural integration going on at the same time. And this isn't just happening in the social relations that people experience in their everyday life. It's also happening with the creation of very particular organizational forms. So the first of these is the Trade Union Congress, right? And the formation of the TUC and the formation in particular of the trade union bureaucracy, as in a group of people based in London who are like the heads of the trade unions, who wear top hats, who hobnob with the bosses and the politicians. That is one of the first creations of this kind of integration. So you get the creation of that trade union leadership. You also vitally get the creation of the Labour Party. And the Labour Party comes directly out. So the Labour Party is a trade union party in this period. However, you've got to understand what British trade unionism looks like to understand what it means for there to be emergence of that kind of trade union politics. So it's fundamentally about this like highest stratum of the workforce being integrated. And this is what then means that the emergence of the vanguard is so important, right? The emergence of the vanguard, particularly through experiences. So you have this 1842, post that, global industrial monopoly, period of immense resource glut, allows the creation and integration of this top part of the British workforce. Then you start to get a decline in that industrial monopoly. So particularly Germany, the United States, France, these all begin to become competitors. So the British ruling class starts to lose access to that exceptional glut of resources that it had. And new forms of organisation emerge that take trade unionism in some senses away from that most privileged strata. So the new unionism, what's going on 1889, 1890, where you're seeing dockers, match girls, other historically unorganised parts of the working class, often migrant parts of the working class or women, taking part in trade unionism, suddenly they start to get organised, right? At the same time, the people who used to be the labour aristocrats, so for instance, some of the engineers who might be making steam engines for export, that kind of thing, they start to get an increasingly raw deal. So you start to get the emergence of what we call a vanguard, or the most politically advanced form of the working class, who are willing to kind of lead the rest of the class with the most advanced line that can gain mass support. They start to emerge out of this deterioration of that global industrial monopoly. And they become increasingly important. First, you have this wave around the new unionism. You also have the Great Unrest that starts in 1910. That is another kind of wave of this. And so by the time we get into the First World War, you have these two quite clear and opposed camps, right? You have the Labour aristocracy with its particular expressions in the form of the Trade Union Congress and the Labour Party, who go with the start of the First World War. And you have the vanguard, which is a much more indistinct, at this point, less coherent, doesn't have the same kind of expression, but you have a kind of a militant rank and file who are not the trade union leaderships, who are not the politicians, who are not the most privileged people in the workforce, who are often made up of this combination of newly organized proletarians who had been, for instance, migrant workers or women, and historically aristocratic elements of the working class who've been pushed downwards, like some of the engineers at this point. And you start to see the emergence of the vanguard as a competitor for working class leadership. And whereas the aristocracy had been setting the direction of travel for the British working class movement for decades and decades up to that point, there begins to be the possibility of something else happening. So we really see these as two dynamic forces that are very interlinked in how the direction of the working class movement gets set. And it's that dance and the kind of challenge for leadership where the rank and file that make up the vanguard kind of go for it, that makes up the fundamental part of the backstory to the book.
You also have, I think, this tension between the rank and file and the bureaucracy, which is, something separate but linked to this tension between the Labour aristocracy and the vanguard. And I think what we discuss in the first chapter of the book is how this process of producing a trade union bureaucracy is a product of this sort of mid-Victorian period of Labour aristocracy maintaining its hold over the trade union movement. It's really a product of that form of trade unionism that emerges post the plug riots and the failure of that struggle. However, when we reach this period of, new unionism and the labour unrest in the 1910s after that, this bureaucracy doesn't vanish. It's not something that can solely exist within the confines of a certain form of trade unionism. Actually, it adapts and it remains. And I think one of my favourite lines in the book, which I can say because I think Callum wrote it and not me, is that the archetypal trade union bureaucrat during this period remained, a top-hatted Victorian gentleman rather than a miner from Staffordshire or wherever else, right? That relationship doesn't greatly change. These people still exist, and they're still fairly reluctant to call official strike action, right? What they are willing to do is adapt. They're willing to open up the unions to this more general workforce because they see an opportunity to maintain their position, or rather they see a threat of losing their power and leadership of these organizations. So they open them up. And this struggle between the aristocracy and the vanguard still continues whilst the bureaucracy remains in place. And what you really see during this period is the emergence of the rank and file in opposition to the bureaucracy that I think really reaches its peak in the 1910s with the labour unrest there. And Woodley Gallagher has a really good saying during the period of the Clyde Workers' Committee, where he says that the rank and file is always against the bosses. They are sometimes against bureaucracy. When they refuse to work with us, we're against them. When they agree to work with us, we'll work with them. That's, paraphrased. So this relationship between bureaucracy and the rank and file is incredibly complicated, and you'll see it change and adapt over these years too. With the increase in unofficial strike, with the increase of sort of mass militant struggles in the 1880s and 1910s, you suddenly see a sort of slight adaptation where unions are more willing to take more industrial, more militant forms of action, if needed, to regain control over these struggles, to regain leadership and prevent a rank and file leadership from emerging. At the same time, whilst the rank and file in certain places, in certain industries, can initiate struggles on a local level and sometimes on a national level, they are yet to build a sort of form of national leadership that can maintain those struggles, spread them to other places, and contest with, the trade union bureaucracy, which has existed for decades and decades, if not a century, right, for long-term leadership over the working class movement. So you have those two sort of tensions and struggles occurring in tandem, and they're interlinked, but they are, slightly different at the same time too.
No, yeah, absolutely. And I think it's one of the things you do highlight in the book, particularly when going between, because the book is split, of course, between 1926 and 2026, is where this replicated and particularly struggles around the organization of precarious workers. One of the examples you highlighted, and when I saw it, I was like, yeah, that was definitely one of the most egregious examples of this was when the gun makers, managers, and bureaucrats union, the GMB, did their kind of sweetheart deal against the independent workers of Great Britain on behalf of Uber, and also, of course, on behalf of Amazon as well. It's almost like they're competing for subscribers or grant money. It's almost like it's almost like they're acting in sort of academic strata, competing for a certain kind of dues and labour. And it does really speak to a loss of, or maybe a gain of a different kind of political coherency in the union, in terms of like, we are meant to be mediators, but in terms of what they're mediating, ends up being affected by a situation of essentially having a stable job with stable pay, or having a stable job with unstable pay. Because if you're a delivery driver, you've got a stable job. The pay is the only thing that isn't stable. You have to be at work, if anything, a lot longer. And I think one of the ways to get into sort of where this translates into the modern day is, and we don't have to give a huge overview, because this will just be spoiling the book. People should go out and buy the book. It is out, I believe, now with Verso. It's out now with Verso. If not, pre-order it. Publishers kind of run on pre-orders these days, comrades, so go pre-order it regardless. But how would we introduce then the 1926 general strike, and how this dynamic that we've just described within the class contributes to its defeat? What would you like people to take away from this book in terms of what happens, and why this dynamic of aristocracy vanguard ends up playing out the way it did?
Yeah, I mean, you'll have the experience of our poor editor at Verso, Tom Hazeldine, where this book is 30,000 words long. That's actually really quite short and quick, and hopefully a fun read. But we kept on turning in drafts that were 60,000 words long, because we wrote the background progressively longer and longer and longer. So we'll have to avoid our tendency to do that.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, this might sound like it's running counter to what you just said, but I promise we'll try and be brief.
People use Slurs and Hegel on this podcast. You can go as long as you want. I just didn't want to say, like, please give away your book for free right now in verbal form. You don't have to do that.
No, but I guess, I mean, to really understand the roots of the general strike, and I mean, we could go back really far, but at the very base level, you have to understand the 1910s in Britain. So, 15 more years prior. You have this upsurge between 1910 and 1914, and there's this really good book called British Syndicalism by Bob Holton, which tracks this whole period, as well as Ralph Darlington's book, of course, from Pluto Press a few years ago, that's called The Great Labour Unrest. And in this period, there's this massive increase in struggles in mining, in transport, in manufacturing, in docks, etc. And what's really important about these struggles is that the vast majority of them are unofficial strikes. They're not supported by the trade union leadership. They're not initiated by the trade union leadership. They're initiated by rank and file militants on the ground. And far from this being a limiting factor, actually, it means that these struggles explode. So in Liverpool, you have a general transport strike that begins from just one section of the workforce, general strike, and soon spreads across the whole city. You have some of these most amazing, glorious struggles happening that are often winning things because the government, the bosses, the unions are scared of where this may go if it continues. At the same time, there's huge amounts of repression. So you have Churchill, who at this point is the Home Secretary for the Liberals, I believe, too. And he's sending troops into various places. People are dying in riots. There's very much both the carrot and the stick. And in sort of the context of these huge unofficial struggles that are happening, you have syndicalism as an ideology spreading. So you have all these rank and file militants, many of them meeting through the Plebs League, which is sort of this alternative labour college that existed at the time, who are creating syndicalist publications, organisations, etc., under the context of trying to argue for mass direct action towards the aim of political revolution. So again, this sort of idea that perhaps started with William Benbow and goes on all the way further is re-emerging. As well as this, they're agitating and they're pushing for trade union amalgamation. So at this time, you have a lot of smaller unions, often local unions or still very craft or sectorial specific unions. And the syndicalists are pushing for amalgamated unions. So industry-wide trade unions where all the different unions that exist as industries merge into one. So there's more industrial power when they go on strike. There's greater levels of industrial democracy, with the aim, I think, eventually of trying to rebuild society based upon these industrial organizations. And they're largely successful in terms of this amalgamation. You see various unions in transport, mining, etc., amalgamate or federate in this point to create larger industrial scale organizations. And these new leaders of these new organizations are incredibly worried about the level of unofficial strikes that are happening, right? They're also being pushed by the rank and file to engage in what is called a triple alliance. So saying that whenever one industry of the important industries in Britain has an issue and goes on strike, the other industries, the workers there, they also go on strike to support them because there's greater industrial leverage when we're all on strike together. The trade union leadership, they see this idea and they say, okay, we can think about this another way. We're both threatened by the emergence of this sort of unofficial movement, this rank and file and this spread of syndicalism. And we don't want to be going on strike all the time whenever there's an issue in any industry, wherever. However, the threat of this action is so huge to the employers that it might prevent us from having to take industrial action, by and large. And by preventing us from having to take industrial action, it prevents the emergence of these rank and file movements that then threaten us for power and trying to compete with us for power. So in 1914, they agree to what becomes known as the Triple Alliance, the Miners' Federation of Great Britain, the National Transport Workers Federation, and the National Union of Railwaymen. They agree this Triple Alliance, saying if one industry goes on strike, they'll support them in principle, not as a an always thing, but in principle, they'll do that. Of course, it never gets tested out because World War I happens. These unions start this industrial process of industrial peace and patriotism. But yeah, Callum, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I can take over the story when Archduke Ferdinand gets chopped. So basically, what happens at the start of World War One is there is this real differentiation whereby basically the Labour aristocracy say, okay, if we throw our lot in completely with the state and the nation, then we can get huge gains out of this. We will prove that we are like loyal subjects, and there'll be massive concessions, we'll have a role in organising industry. Maybe there'll be something like state socialism that will emerge out of this. So we're going to go all in, right? So the Labour Party, the Trade Union Congress, they go all in. With the exception of the Miners' Federation of Great Britain, they all sign these things called the Treasury Agreements, right? And the Treasury Agreements are basically like, we're not going to have any restrictive practices on the shop floor, e.g. we will maximise production and eliminate any resistance to the bosses speeding things up. We will accept dilution, so we'll basically allow you to bring in women to the workplace, for instance, unskilled workers, they'll be allowed to come into the workplace in a way that trade unions would have resisted because they were trying to defend the conditions of their more skilled members in that kind of sectional aristocratic way. And also we're going to make strikes illegal, right? So we're not going to go on strike. That's what the trade union leadership say. Now, what this does is, in a new kind of industrialized war where munitions production is absolutely central, it's fundamental to the total war effort. So it's a huge part of how the state responds to the industrial butchery of the Western Front. And it gives the state the power to do this. At the same time, it massively reduces kind of the civil rights and freedoms and political freedoms people have been experiencing. So, for instance, one of the major Marxist organizations in Britain at this point, which was founded in part by James Connolly, the Socialist Labour Party, is forced underground. So its organisers, like Bembo, are running from place to place, never sleeping in the same bed twice, and have to go underground basically for the duration of the war. So there is this massive restriction in the ability to strike, the ability to organise, the ability to speak freely. And this crushes the ability of the official trade union movement to effectively represent the working class. But at the same time, there are huge things to oppose. Real wages are going through the floor. The price of food goes up 68% during the First World War, whilst real wages are falling rapidly, particularly for that very skilled layer. For them, wages are falling super fast. And you get this process of class consolidation occurring, particularly in the big munitions centres, where you get lots of new workers entering the workplace in the war industries. They're often women, unskilled, people who haven't historically been integrated in the trade union movement. They're entering into the workplace, and their wages are actually doing better in real terms than the more skilled workers. And the more skilled workers are suffering a more dramatic collapse in real wage increases. So you get bigger workplaces, and more kind of collaborative and cooperative processes going on in those workplaces, and a smaller wage differential between the less skilled and the more skilled. So all of this, it produces something that J.T. Murphy, who's one of the key figures of this period, calls class consolidation. So an increasingly united class with very real reasons to be extremely angry at the state and the trade unions starts to take action. And they start to do this in particular through the shop stewards movement, which is this independent rank and file movement at its strongest in Glasgow and Sheffield whereby workers completely bypass the official trade unions. Now, it's these networks that will produce, in particular, the militants who make up, for instance, the Communist Party, right? This is where the leadership of Willie Gallagher, J.T. Murphy, other people like that, this is where they're coming from. So they lead strikes, and this movement is never particularly simple, right? At times, it's defending the interests of the most skilled engineers. Other times, it's almost a revolutionary movement against the war. And it vacillates wildly between these two poles and is completely incoherent because of the level of state repression and the way it's organized. But this sets off a period that I think we focus on very strongly and called kind of the post-revolutionary decade, because really from 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 and the general strike in 1926 is this period of incredibly febrile working class struggle in Britain. And what we see happening over and over again across this period is the people who've been formed by this unofficial movement, the vanguard that has been shaped through class consolidation that's made up of both these downwardly mobile aristocrats and newly organized mass workers, this process leads them into kind of very deep forms of conflict with the state that often verge on the revolutionary. And so as the war winds down, there is both an increase in unemployment, but then also huge concessions. And these concessions are being granted hand over fist because the ruling class is incredibly scared of what's going on, because this triple alliance threat seems to be coming to fruition. Just to give one particular example, in the book we talk about 9 different moments in that post-revolutionary decade which were better suited for a revolutionary general strike than the one we ended up with in 1926. But there is basically this process where the state sees the organisation of the working class, in particular, I mean, the 40-hour strike in Glasgow has got to be one of the clearest examples, where the engineers start fighting for a reduction in working time, in particular to integrate returning demobilised soldiers into production again to make sure there's enough work to go around. They start fighting for this. They set demands that are much more ambitious of the national trade union leaderships than of the bureaucracy. And they are ready to organise a general strike to try and achieve it. They send people around the country. At a point, it seems possible that the power is going to be cut off to London. The strike really, there are already very significant mobilisations. There are mutinies going on in the army. I mean, this period, we really don't remember in the conventional British understanding quite how the First World War came to an end. Not only with revolutions in Russia and a revolutionary situation in Germany, but also at the exact same time that Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht are fighting for the Spartacists in Berlin, you also have near-revolutionary situations, I would argue, emerging in Britain at the same time. So this then leads us into a period where the Communist Party emerges as kind of one of the coordinating poles, and this leads to the creation of the National Minority Movement in 1924 in the trade unions, where they're trying to organise essentially the revolutionary minority within all these different trade unions, and trying to push increasingly for a more and more aggressive strategy from the Trade Union Congress, and push for some of these opportunities that are emerging and the concessions that are being won. We need to go further. We need to go further all the time. At the same time, the state has been doing this thing where every time a threat emerges, there's a particularly large strike or a threat of a triple alliance strike, concessions are given. And then at a certain point, they decide they don't want to give any concessions anymore. So this takes up to 1925. Matt, do you want to take over the story and particularly the coal industry at that point?
Yeah, so in the coal industry, like Callum said, there've been in World War I these huge struggles that have resulted in the coal industry being temporarily nationalised. And in the period after World War I, you see them start to be denationalised again, to be reprivatised towards the coal owners. Now, the wages that were being given when these coalfields were nationalised, as well as the effects of decreasing import value of British coal, means that currently the mines are not profitable if things continue the way they are. And the mine owners, as soon as they are re-given the coalfields in 1921, they seek to cut wages. This becomes like the first proper test of the Triple Alliance that was formed all the way back in 1914. So there's the first time, really, there's pressure for the official trade union movement to support the miners. They've been locked out because they're refusing to work for these new wages. Their unions calling for the other unions, National Union of Railwaymen, National Transport Workers Federation and others, the TUC, to support them to invoke the Triple Alliance and to strike. Eventually, the leadership of these unions decide not to. They essentially don't see a strike of that kind being beneficial to them, particularly the leader of the National Union of Railwaymen, Jimmy Thomas, who's like the villain of our book because he's so awful, has just had a successful dispute in his industry. He sees a potential general strike as creating alternative poles of power to himself, and therefore retracts any support for this struggle. That day becomes known as Black Friday by trade unionists because of the fact that the workers, or the unions rather, refused to come to support of the miners. 4 years later, in 1925, you basically have a redo of this situation. where the value of imports has drastically fallen for stuff like coal because of the government's imposition of the gold standard, or attempt to reimpose the gold standard, which meant that, the value of these exports fell because they become relatively more expensive on the world market. Ironically, this also puts a drain on the country's gold reserves because they're having to sell gold to make up for the loss of value of these raw exports. So the mine owners and the government essentially are united in an effort to cut miners' wages, to try and make the export of coal at least somewhat profitable again. In the meantime, you've also had the General Council formed for the TUC. So this is a new coordinating body between the unions that hadn't existed in 1921. And the TUC at this point is moving slightly more leftwards. There are various communist-aligned minority groups that like Callum mentioned, not only sought to organise the rank and file, but also engage in this sort of broad leftism that perhaps predominates trade unions now, where they're trying to elect people into positions, and particularly into positions that hold seats on the TUC's General Council. And they succeed in a variety of smaller, sort of more craft unions. And whilst they don't have a majority at all on this General Council, there's certainly pressure being felt from the more traditional, conservative, more rightward-leaning trade union leaders on there to respond to this pressure being faced on the ground from these movements. So in the face of this great pressure from the base, and with, in general, a better coordination between the TUC, this time when the miners are locked out for refusing to work for, again, these cut wages, the TUC does call a general strike. They say, we will strike if these wages are refused to be cut. And the government backs off, right? But they don't want to just keep the unions happy. They want to keep the miners happy. So what the government does is say, we'll subsidize the miners' wages for at least the next 9 months. And this day becomes known as Red Friday in opposition to Black Friday, because workers are celebrating what they see as a victory of the trade union movement in expressing its power by threatening to go on strike, but not actually doing it in support of the miners. They've won these concessions. But what really has happened is actually the government is just buying time for a broader battle. They're buying time to actually fight the miners, because they know at this point in 1925, they've not made adequate preparations. They're not ready for the battle that the general strike would be, and they need to gain that time in order to make those preparations, right? So whilst the TUC is celebrating, patting itself on the back, whilst many workers are celebrating, the government's making immense preparations for a struggle to come. They're setting up quasi-fascist voluntary organizations that can not only continue to work and gain middle-class volunteers to work during any future industrial dispute, but also is preparing to arm these individuals as special constables to break up mass pickets, to break strikes, etc. They're coordinating a series of civil commissioners who will essentially run different regions of Britain in the event of any revolutionary outbreak occurring from a general strike. They're making very detailed preparations for that struggle that's about to occur. Now, this 9 months happens. The subsidies are starting to run out. The TUC re-enters back into negotiations with the government. Again, they say that, if the subsidies are not continued, they'll be forced to call a general strike. But this time, that threat is not so big for the government. They've made these preparations. They've had 9 months to put them in place. And in fact, they want this fight to happen, right? They want an opportunity to try and crush an insurgent labour movement. They want an opportunity to demoralise it. So they play extremely hardball. They say, no, we're not going to give any subsidies at all. Now, there's this great pressure from below, from the rank and file, who are pretty much the only ones who've been organising this period for the prospect of a general strike. It's pretty much, the Communist Party, the National Minority Movement, and other sort of local committees in various areas that are the ones who've put any sort of preparation into the prospects of general strike, because they're pretty much the only ones who believe that it could actually happen. So the union leaders, on the other hand, are begging the government for anything. Jimmy Thomas, again, the villain of sort of our story, he's going to the government and he's saying, please give me anything I can take back to my members on the ground to say is a win, to say is a concession that we've got based upon this.
Like at this point, hysterically convinced that he's going to die. He keeps on over and over again. He's like, they are going to kill me. If a revolutionary situation happens, my own members are going to shoot me. Please, please, please.
That is one of the best parts of the book, I got to say. Just the concentration of he's going to the government as if he's kind of an equal, and he's like, I'm really sorry, I can't hold this back. As if, well, Surely that's meant to be your job, is in a sense to sort of direct this, to channel this.
I mean, he's the Labour colonial secretary. He's an ex-minister. He has been in charge of India. That's his mindset, right? He's not doesn't see himself as a worker. He certainly doesn't see himself as a revolutionary. He sees himself as a co-manager of the state.
And Churchill will later say during the general strike that the problem with it was there wasn't enough of trade unionism, that trade unionism didn't prosper over this rank and file sort of more militant tendency, right? That people like Jimmy Thomas couldn't contain and keep control over the sectors that they supposedly led. But yeah, they're begging the government for anything, and the government is not forthcoming. And the subsidies end, miners' wages are cut, and again, miners are locked out of work, right? So effectively forced to go on strike unless they refuse to work for less pay and work more hours, in fact, for less pay. The TUC, despite this, continues to negotiate. They still don't call, even after the miners are locked out, the wage cuts effectively enforced. They're refusing to call a general strike, right? They're not saying they're not calling a general strike, but they refuse to actually call one. They insist they're continuing to negotiate with the government, even though they have no leverage to negotiate with at this point. And the government is obviously not wanting to play ball at all. And in the end, the people who pulled the trigger for the strike are not the trade union officials. It's rank and file print workers. So in the Daily Mail, the editors attempt to publish this incredibly anti-trade union front page, specifically against the prospect of a general strike. And the print workers in the print shops, they refuse to print it. They say, no way, we will not print this newspaper until you remove this front page. Owners of Daily Mail, they call up Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister, and they explain what's happening. And Stanley Baldwin says, at least in our perspective, okay, here's the opportunity for me to start this fight that I want with the labour movement. He gets in touch with the TUC. He tells the TUC that he's calling off negotiations because the actions of workers and organised workers has infringed on freedom of speech, which is a sort of sacred value, and he cannot stand for it. And he says there's no more negotiations. I'm calling them off because of this. So the TUC is left with essentially no other option but to call a general strike because they've been threatening it. The government has not only said no to giving any concessions, but has now called off negotiations. So very reluctantly, the TUC sends out these telegrams to various industries, to various union branches saying, okay, from tomorrow, there will be a general strike. But even in this, they're very conservative in it. They only call out specific industries. They don't call out all unions at once. They don't call out all workers at once. They call out specific industries with the claim that they're going to escalate this, right? Whether they intend to actually escalate it is another question, but they only call out certain industries, predominantly miners, print workers, transport workers, dockers, etc. And the general strike begins. And if you want to know what happens in the actual general strike, you'll have to buy the book.
There we go. And of course, we got the real important thing here, which is actually the striking print workers were the real villains, of course, because they oppressed the sacred free speech of the Daily Mail, which, of course, is the true leftist position that we must always engage in the marketplace of ideas. I'm, of course, taking the piss, listeners. That was a brilliant history. And you do get a real sense of in the book of where the heads of the labour movement ends up faltering. You track it, of course, across these three key sites of struggle, namely South Wales, Swindon, and East London. Then you use that sort of jump between the time periods of 1926 and the present day. Particularly, for example, a good example was in South Wales, talk about Tata Steel. Actually, it's one of the last industrial hubs in South Wales. I just wanted to ask, what was it like visiting these places, sort of, in a way, doing a little bit of active sort of anthropology, archaeology of these places, and going there? How has the class composition shifted from the stuff he was investigating historically? And did it feel like almost that the place was haunted by this? I'm not going to pull the hauntology card, that's a bit too trite, but haunted by the spectres of this revolt which failed to materialize. Oh, not failed, was defeated. Failed implies it was all on its own terms, but
yeah, maybe we should focus on South Wales. In particular, in South Wales, we're talking about a pit village called Bedlinog, right? And Bedlinog is an absolutely fascinating place. I mean, you talk about haunting. When we went there, we ended up in a pub with some people who they'd been to a funeral, and we were drinking with them. We crashed the wake, basically. And there was the ruins of an old chapel across the road. I mean, it's very much like it wasn't hard to find some of the Gothic vibes. They were all around. And we were hearing jokes like, what do you do if you grow up in Bedlinog? You either join the army, get a trade, or do drugs. Those are the options, right? So this was the kind of situation we landed in. And the story of Bednanog is remarkable because this goes from a sleepy agricultural valley with few inhabitants to essentially becoming a migrant work camp when it becomes a pit village and the industrial hub of the global shipping industry, because South Wales steam coal becomes fundamental for global trade. I mean, it's refilling coaling stations all over the world. It's the fuel of choice because of its particular character, its particular clean burning character for basically all navies and shipping in Western Europe and many railways across Europe as well, because you get a lot of energy out of a limited amount of weight. That's South Wales steam coal for you. So this place is totally transformed. You've got migrants coming from the South Wales region is filling up as fast as the United States at this point in time, right? So colossal migration. And this produces Bednanog out of nothing, right? It's built around originally these two pits, Bednanog and Nantwen. Actually, at the period of the general strike, those have just closed down, and there's another pit opening down the valley. But it's part of this kind of colossal transformation, all based around one very particular point of industrial unity, which is the coal industry, right? And coming out of the coal industry, you also have this connection to iron. There's a lot of flow through. Not only does the production of iron in blast furnaces require a lot of coal and a lot of energy in general, there are kind of it makes a lot of sense to co-locate these industries. So people writing at the time about the experience of being a miner in winter. Obviously, if you're doing an underground shift in the winter, you're not going to see the sun. But when you come out of the pits at night, you might see, because of the blast furnaces up at Merthyr, you might see this kind of red glow illuminating the whole valley, which again, the Gothic undertones are not difficult to find. So it's really one industry dominates the entire community. It's an occupational community where everyone basically works in the same place and the bosses live in the big house at the top of the hill. It's about as clear as you could get. The state provides little, if any, infrastructure to these villages. So they basically produce a very proletarian form of culture, right? The creation of chapels, jazz bands, football teams, rugby teams, choirs, all of this kind of social infrastructure focused often around the miners' lodge is purely a product of proletarian self-organisation. And so this particular form of working class, which has come from the rural parts of Western England, north of Wales, Spain, Durham, all over the world, and concentrated together in these migrant work communities, is particularly working class, particularly united. When you go there today, obviously, that's no longer the case. The last pit closes in the 90s, I think it is, in Bednanog. And that closure basically means that there's no more connection to that historic industry. Now you have a village that's split up into a vast array of different industries. The skilled trades play a huge role. Lots of people are traveling out of the village to work elsewhere. People are sometimes migrant workers working in other countries and coming back home when they can. Where they're working, it's often retail, low productivity service work. Sometimes they'll be able to find jobs doing work on reservoirs and wind farms, which are a large part of the regional economy. But by and large, there is none of that industrial coherence. There's a lot of kind of organised abandonment, people being left behind by this process. And this has led to a dramatic political transformation. Whereas this was one of two little villages known as Little Moscows, right? Because it was a communist-dominated village. The Communist Party was the biggest single political organisation. During the general strike in Bednanog, the workers there get a remarkable degree of control over social life. Essentially, the state is like, we cannot control that. We're having to fight in London, we're having to fight in Cardiff. We're going to leave the pit villages to themselves. And they come almost fully under working class control, where there is a remarkable level. The revolution kind of happens in Bednanog, right? Like, it doesn't happen permanently, it doesn't happen forever, and the control they have rapidly kind of depletes when they're left abandoned by the failure of the TUC to hold out in support of the miners. But it's this cauldron of politics. If you go there now and reform, or that kind of hard right fascist politics is the dominant political force in that area now. Nigel Farage goes to Port Talbot, which is just out the bottom of the valleys there, and says, we're going to bring back coal mining, we're going to do X, Y, Z. And that's the political voice that people feel most aligned to. But what was remarkable, I think, from the conversation that I remember, and this is what me and Matthew talked about as we drove out of the village that night, was that there was no greater legitimacy for the kind of political and social system that people lived under than there was. It's not like, in the 1920s, people thought capitalism was bad and now people think capitalism is great. That hasn't happened, right? No one is persuaded the legitimacy of the Westminster political system. No one is persuaded that this economy looks after them. No one is persuaded that we're all part of a great national community united under the benevolent billionaires. That's not what people believe. The only thing is that oppositional stance is increasingly being captured by elements of the xenophobic racist far right, rather than being organised through what was once a communist politics and a communist lens.
Yeah, and I think, not to bring it back to Mark Fisher again, but this idea of there is no alternative was really present, particularly when to Badenoch, right? Is that the people we met, particularly ones we spent a lot of time talking to, they were not fans of reform. They didn't like that politics. They saw themselves as relatively progressive people. They might read and digest and follow various different news outlets, etc., that tend to be more progressive. But there was no sort of overtly political movement, right, in that place, compared to, let's say, in 1926, where you had this base in the Communist Party, in the Labour movement, that connected it to a national and even international political movement, right? Here, they don't have any of that, largely because the single industry that tied that all together no longer exists, and everyone's working here, there, and everywhere. They may all live in Badenoch, but they work in Swansea, Port Talbot, up in Dowlais, wherever, up in Merthyr, and therefore the politics that seems to become dominant is the one that seems to be the most viable, that seems to be the most present, and that just happened to be reform, right, in this particular moment, and particularly a moment where we visited, where they're shooting up in the polls. That seems like the viable alternative political movement that maybe will change something, right? If you're desperate for any sort of change, that's the thing that's going to change something. And part and parcel of the politics of building a socialist movement is actually building some level of organization, some level of something that people can attach themselves to, that they can engage in. It's not good enough just to convince someone of the ideas. There needs to be a way for them to enact them, right? And I think what was really interesting about the people we spoke to is they said, we talked politics and we said, we're communists, we're trade unionists. And one of them said, oh, I've never met a communist before. That's really interesting. And they wanted to talk to us about that, right? They all worked in trades, but they weren't all in trade unions, despite being in, quite traditional blue collar industries, plumbers, gas engineers, etc. So there was this level of a need for greater political organization, and this question of proletarian disorganization again come to the forefront. And I think one last thing is particularly one of the people we spoke to, they said they were going to vote Green. They were really excited to talk to us. They were very, deeply scarred by the genocide happening in Gaza. They're not by any means someone that lent towards reforms politics or the politics of the far right, but they worked as an electrician in building a new hospital ward in Swansea. And one of the things they said to us is that they think the NHS is completely overfunded. There's this massive bloat. And actually, we need, a way to cut it, to make it more efficient, something equivalent to Doge for the UK, right? This sort of political talking point that you more associate with Nigel Farage, the hard right, rather than the Greens, for example, they said they were going to vote for. But when you dug into it, the reason they believe this is because they have these overbearing managers telling them to do this way, do this way, etc. When they knew better, when they knew that that's not the most efficient way to do this thing, when that just creates more work for them, and they fucking resented that. And that's actually a completely legitimate perspective to have, right? And we put forward the idea we said, yeah, we completely agree with you. And actually, that's why we're communists, because we believe that the working class knows best how to run society, knows best how to run its own workplaces because of the knowledge we hold. And I'm not sure that we entirely convinced them, converted them to being a comrade there and then, but they were certainly interested in the idea, right? So the left needs to find a way to connect with people who actually very easily could be natural allies to us, right? It's not like these places are cesspits of just full of racists and whatever. They're actually very, very, very complicated, very, very messy, but actually contain a lot of people who naturally will be predisposed towards socialist ideas because they live under a system that fucking hurts and oppresses them. And I think that's, yeah.
And I think what's remarkable is that in that situation, in that pub, in that conversation, if we had sat down and started advocating for what people might think of as more, certainly what Keir Starmer might think of as more grown-up, sensible politics, right? If you start articulating a kind of lowest common denominator, Labourism, a kind of social democracy as it still exists in the 21st century as a pale shadow imitation of itself, if we'd started saying that, that sounds significantly less realistic and more cloud cuckoo than a much more militant rank and file politics, right? And even if you don't articulate it as full revolutionary politics and the full gamut of our crazy ideas and opinions, if you just articulated it as working people have to be organized to fight for our own interests, to use the bonds of community we have with one another in the workplace and in the places where we live to fight for a different kind of system, that is significantly more commonsensical than this kind of Labourist, we're going to have a compromise with capital, and actually like these forces that are fucking you over like Tata Steel down in Port Talbot, they're actually going to care about you and they're going to pay their taxes. That's nonsense. No one believes that. No one believes that in Port Talbot. No one believes that in Bedlanog. No one believes that in South Wales, because they can see transparently it's not real. The reason I think, and this maybe is a simplified diagnosis, but the far right's response to that situation can thrive in a situation of disorganization, right? The far right can thrive where social ties are weak, where people are atomized, where people's consumption of news and media through kind of algorithmic feeds produces a very specific kind of engagement, and where people feel understandably huge amounts of anger and resentment as what's been done to their communities and what's happened to their lives, right? Even we talk to retired steel workers in Port Talbot who over the course of their life have seen these colossal transformations, and not for the better, right? And not for the better. So whereas they, the far right, have the opportunity to thrive in atomization, our politics actually has much more material connection to situations on the ground. No one wants to. Nigel Farage went to Talbot and said, we're going to reopen the coal mines. Stories about how their family members have been like horrifically maimed by working in coal mines. They were singing songs about how much they fucking hated coal mines. No one wants to do that, right? Actually, the far right doesn't have an understanding concretely of what politics would necessarily be the best place to represent hope and a future of the people of Port Talbot and Bedlanog. But what they do have is the ability to thrive where there are not organisations. So I think one of the fundamental insights of what we're trying to say here is that organisation at the rank and file level, the creation of thicker social ties, the kind of putting people into structures where they can understand their agency in relationship with their neighbours and their co-workers. This is really a vital step. But once that vital step starts to happen, I believe me and Matt are quite united on the idea that there could be a very rapid potential shift in the political language that we're hearing on the ground.
No, yeah, and I want to pick up a particular point about what you've both been saying. This isn't a book that is in any way particularly nostalgic. No one wants to go work back in the fucking coal mines. I think we've had enough Ken Loach movies. We don't need to do a sort of cosplay of the people that lose in every one of his movies. Apart from When the Shakes to Barley, that's my favourite one. But usually a lot of Labour history is like, we could do this, we could do it again, but as if we could still like magically bring back those exact material conditions. And sometimes the realism of, hard men hit thing with hammer, caricatures of the working class can end up being about as unrealistic as a social democratic compromise is today, Well, all we need is the exact historic circumstances of a bunch of nuclear armed Russians and 2 world wars, and about 60% of the population can get better dentistry. That's definitely not as realistic as your boss needs you to work. What if you all stop working? Maybe he might listen to you, and then he might realize you don't need to listen to him anymore. There is at least, it's obviously a vast simplification, but there is nonetheless a fundamental through line to the pressure points of a Labour-based society, which is practically all of them. And I did want to ask, in terms of going beyond this, because the book is called The Future in Our Past, and of course you talk a lot about Labour disorganisation, both in the idea that the vanguard is disorganised in the sense that the work it's doing is often very diffuse, very precarious, at the same time as the aristocracy is disorganised because they mostly do speeches and make deals and reproduce their own particular class positions. But then also you say that there's a bit of hope here, and not just in sort of the fluffiest sense possible. I mean hope in the sense that the ruling class is also pretty disorganized, even though they're the only class that is constantly fighting the class struggle. And I think your analysis, your history of the general strike is a good way of depicting that, is that even if your sort of higher ups in the Labour movement don't want to fight this struggle, there is one side that is always fighting it, because they are the ones who are paid to do so. The very fact they get paid presupposes they continue it. Where do you think, or where have you found sort of outcroppings of new rank and file organisation, particularly amongst more precarious forms of labour. Because I think when people think about things like the general strike, they think, okay, that might have been easier, but easier, quote unquote, partially for a few reasons. One, because people were a bit more flexible in terms of their relationships to the law. So, for example, sympathy strikes being illegal, secondary action being illegal, people would think, can't do an illegal thing. It has to be sort of in a set of juridically recognised and socially valued norms. But also the fact that, it was easy for them. They had one job. It wasn't 40 jobs. They could, you could protest your manager. It's hard to protest as an app, so to speak. Where do you see elements of rank and file organising that start to put the challenge to these circumstances, or rather that might even be organising because of these circumstances?
There's really two examples in the last few years that stick out for me that perhaps it's to slightly greater and lesser degrees. So I think the first is the Amazon wildcat strikes that happened all the way back in 2022 now, which God, I remember that was 4 years ago. This is a strike that emerges from one warehouse from Tilbury and quickly spreads to various others, basically through social media. And to some degree, organic leaders emerge in these situations and they're put into sort of negotiations with the bosses, and then they're coming back to the canteens where all the workers are sitting down, refusing to work and being told what to go back to the bosses to say more. But that's a level of activity in an industry that people basically have said it's impossible to unionize. It's impossible to take action in. And even now, the GMBs fought this very hard battle in the warehouse in Coventry to try and gain recognition. And those strikes haven't seen the level of participation that these unofficial rank and file struggles did, right? And to some degree, it's perhaps the lack of organization, the lack of sort of trade union authority that allowed them to happen. Because if there had been a trade union branches in those warehouses when people are kicking off over the pay increases they are offered, you can almost certainly say that a large section of the workforce would not have gone out because they would have been told by the trade unions that you can't just walk out without taking the official routes to balance the etc. Right? What that struggle lacked was the emergence of a new rank and file leadership across that. So these strikes happened, they burnt bright, and then they burnt out, and nothing really emerged from that that could coordinate continuing action or continuing organisation across rank and file Amazon workers in Britain and further abroad. I think the slightly more hopeful example is of the food courier strikes that happened a couple of years ago now, that me and Callum also were involved in. And in fact, some of the stuff from the book in the East London chapter is from contacts we made during that period. When platforms like Uber, Deliveroo, etc. came onto the scene, people saw this as the death of any form of collective industrial action, of the ability for people to organize in these industries, because they're so alienated, they're so different to the traditional workplace that people are used to, right? And the employment relationship is not even one of necessarily employee and employer in the same way anymore. It's highly mediated by the different employment statuses, right? But again, this is where class composition comes into it. You can see this thing as a weakness, but actually, when workers began taking action for the first time in this industry, it could be seen as a strength, the fact they had a different employment status, that they had a slightly more precarious existence, because to take strike action, they didn't need to jump through these hoops to ballot, to have a trade union branch necessarily even. They simply could just log off an app because they were self-employed, right? So therefore they can dictate as and when they work, which means they can also dictate when they don't work, when they go on strike. And a couple of years ago, we saw a new level emerge in this movement. And I think it's safe to say, me and Callum, having previously been involved in food courier strikes in the past, we're feeling quite demoralized about the prospect of this movement continuing. There have been recurrent strikes for various years that gained a lot of participation, but usually in specific cities, happened for a day or two and then sort of burnt out and didn't re-emerge and didn't necessarily win anything. A lot of the union structures that have been built during this time hadn't really grown very large, hadn't really stabilized to create larger forms of organization. But then in 2024, we see this massive food courier strike emerge in London that we find out just because Callum sees a sticker on the street on someone's backpack riding an e-bike, and he flags him down and he asks him about it. And this strike spreads to so many different other cities in Britain and places where you wouldn't expect it to emerge, like Blackpool, small cities in the West Midlands or Yorkshire. Really becomes national and quite well coordinated, right? There is a level of organization here. And when we delved into it and we got to meet these people and we joined the WhatsApp groups they're in, right? you had all these different local groups who were then either electing or just putting in place their own capital. The fact that that could emerge in a time where it felt like it was so impossible for something like that to emerge, I think can give us a lot of hope, and really speaks to the prospects of reorganizing our class and having a movement, a strong rank and file movement. And I think I know we said we don't particularly like Ken Loach movies or the narrative they imbue nowadays, but my favorite Ken Loach movie is The Big Flame, which is set in the docks of Liverpool, right? And the thing I love about that film is that it's all about trying a new tactic, trying something that feels like it's not possible, but they say, fuck it, we're going to go for it, right? Fuck it, we're going to occupy the docks because we've not done this before. And although it might seem crazy and it might not work, we don't know that until we've tried it, and we may as well try it. And there's this fantastical struggle that emerges from that then inspires other people elsewhere to engage in that. And I think that's what we need more of today. We need people to just try and do things and not be so bogged down in the idea this isn't possible in the specific historical circumstance we're in. Yes, you have to adapt it. Yes, you have to read the class composition that you exist in, but you've got to be ambitious and you've got to try things. And that's what the book is trying to do. It's trying to both demystify the general strike and say, look, this wasn't just a coincidence. It didn't happen because everything was perfect. Actually, it was very difficult at various different points, right? But it happened because there was a conscious political project from various people in the decades before that created the structure, that created the politics that allowed for that movement to occur. And that's what we need to be doing today.
The more I learn about Labour history, the more annoyed I get at the narrative that people will trot out every time you talk about this stuff, that, oh, well, it was possible to have industrial organisation back then because everything was in place that made it really easy, whereas now it's really hard. It's like, motherfucker, unemployment at the start of the general strike is at 10%. In Bedlinog, unemployment, we don't have data for it, but would have been easily over 50%. Right. And these are the places where the most militant struggles are being organised. These are people working underground under almost total managerial control, where there are like fascists being hired into the mines in order to do the kind of labour discipline, where they don't have guaranteed access to healthcare because there isn't a national healthcare system. Like, the imagination that people have that these past generations of workers were given the ability to organise on a plate is about as dramatically inaccurate as you could possibly get. The nature of organising as workers is we start from disadvantageous conditions and we turn it around. And we turn it around through this miraculous fucking chemistry that occurs when one person decides to organise with another person and to turn their kind of cooperative relationships that they have in everyday life and labour into a political weapon. And that bit of alchemy, where you turn yourself from an atomised individual into someone who is a member of a class, and a class that has its own forms of organisation, never starts from a position of it being inevitable or easy. It starts from a position of the odds being dramatically stacked against you. There's a great line from Mario Tronti, the Italian workerist, that, you know, even when the domination of the boss seems total, that's when the menace of the workers is at its deepest, right? At these moments of seemingly total managerial control, actually at those points, developments are ongoing. Technical, social recompositions are ongoing that will give us forms of power we can find in the future. In terms of how do we think about these struggles, I think the examples Matthew gives are wonderful, right? Those are two struggles that have deeply impacted the way that I think about politics. And I think they are some of the most exciting that have occurred in Britain in the time that I've been politically active, since a long time ago. I think what stands out about those is they both floundered on the inability to create rank and file structures. So in both cases, trade unions were not present or wildly ineffective. And this created a void into which workers stepped, where they discovered their own power and began to use forms of collective organisation to kind of transform that. And in both of those examples would be they're kind of like the new unionism, right? These are workers who've been written off as unorganisable, who are stepping up and showing they can be organised. And they just need to find and create forms of structure that allow that to perpetuate in order for those struggles to have more success. We're also seeing at the moment a similar kind of this downwardly mobile aristocratic figure starting to organise and also facing some of the same challenges. So I work at the University of Essex at the moment. The management are in the process of attempting to cut 400 jobs. That's about 20% of our workforce. We're facing a catastrophic situation in universities across the country. People who work in higher education will be very familiar with the kind of job cuts we're talking about. There are tens of thousands of us being thrown on the scrap heap, careers ruined, the ability to educate students destroyed, entire degree programs, courses of study being thrown away, and equally the quality of educational experience that young people have been given being destroyed. This is like a common experience for loads of us, right? And our national trade union leadership is completely absent. The UCU, University and Colleges Union, has failed to grasp the significance of this moment, has completely failed to step up and defend universities as institutions that have a kind of public role, or that could have a public role in a better society, and education as a valuable social process. So we've been left behind by our trade unions. I experience on the ground at Essex and my trade union, to be really frank, and I'm only saying this because we're quite far into the podcast, to be really frank, I experience our national trade union mostly as a hindrance rather than a help to our organising on the ground. When we're trying to organise strike days, we have them coming in and telling us, you can't do this, you can't do that. Oh, can we get some legal help? No, you can't get legal help. And if you ask for legal help outside of the trade union, we'll ban you from access to the trade union legal fund. Those are the kind of experiences we have in that kind of downwardly mobile aristocratic layer. And in response, people are trying to form these forms of rank and file coordination. So for instance, the Essex branch is in constant communication with Queen Mary, with Goldsmiths, with King's College, with other branches who have more experience or who have different positionality. And that kind of formation of a rank and file alternative pole of attraction, where our general secretary is doing fucking nothing for us, but actually the branch secretaries at Goldsmith, the branch secretaries at other branches around London are teaching me what I need to be doing and how I can be organising on my own campus. That process indicates to us how these kind of rank and file leaderships get formed, not just because we decide they're a good thing to build or that they're like politically advantageous to make them, but because they are the necessary next step in turning our struggles into something more militant, right? We start to see the creation of rank and file structures at this moment in time as being like, this is how we go from a strike wave, which occurred kind of dominated by trade unions. It was called by them, and when they decided they didn't want to carry on, it just stopped. How do we turn that into a movement, a militant workers movement that can start to not only force the hand of our employer, but also start to think about how we reorganize society? We need forms of rank and file coordination. Those need to be built now, not at some putative point in the future when organizing will be easy, right? And they need to be built through the process of the struggles we're having now. And the point about agency, I think, is absolutely critical to the message of the book, which is the people in Swindon, in Bedlanog, in East London, in the decade before the general strike, did not know in advance that what they were doing was going to lead to these potential opportunities. What they saw themselves as doing was cranking out leaflets on a mimeograph, having one-to-one conversations, organising a speaker to come and talk to a meeting, organising a trade union branch, doing the admin of membership systems. That's what they actually saw in their daily life. But what it added up to, when added to work of thousands of other people, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of other people across the country, it added up to a movement. So all of us need to have the capacity to see the really fucking boring everyday shit we have to do, in the really difficult, upsetting, painful stuff that is involved in building movements. We have to see in that the germ of something that could be transformative. Because look at the world around you right now. Right? Look at what's going on with Iran. Look at what's going to be happening with fertilizer prices, with oil prices, with fucking helium that's required to run MRI. Look at all the kind of systemic contingencies of what's going on with the collapse of the American empire. Hopefully the collapse of the American empire. We can all pray a little bit. Look at what's going on with climate change, which seemingly the entire ruling class has decided they are no longer dealing with, right? That we are just going to speed run fucking climate collapse. And think about the political contingencies that are going to come out of these processes. The ruling class and their disorganisation, the Labour Party and the Tories are no longer the biggest parties in British polls. This is mad, right? The political system is collapsing and their control of it is collapsing. And maybe we don't see our greatest opportunities are going on through Parliament, but there will be moments where the complete disintegration of the form of capitalism we have lived most of our life under will create kind of opportunities for us. And if we do the work now, we can be positioned to take them. So actually, 1926 isn't half as far away as it sounds, right? It's much closer to us in our opportunity to talk to each other, to find the relationships that could build something new. And the closest we can come in our moments right now to doing what they did back then, the most immediate route to that is through that organizational work, through discovering our own agency and pursuing it as far as we possibly can.
Fuck yeah. Those are actually beautiful contributions, the way to end it. I mean, so folks, The Future in Our Past is out soon from Verso Books. You can pre-order it now and then get it if you can't get it pre-ordered. Just go get it. If you are a worker and you would like to write about your experiences at work, I believe there's a kind of journal, that may have a kind of podcast.
Yeah, notes below. It's the project me and Matthew both work on. We believe that a really core part to this reorganisation of a radical militant workers movement in Britain it involves people talking about their work and their experiences at work. So please do check us out on notesbelow.org.
Hell yeah. Thanks everyone for listening, and thanks for Callum and Matthew for joining me.
Thanks again for having us. It's been great.
Cheers. Thank you, man.